I was asked to make a video about living and working in Japan for 10 years. This is my 10th year living in Japan. It's very exciting, and I've been reminiscing about the last 10 years and just generally how much working has changed, because living and working in Japan really has changed in this last 10 years, as I'm sure it has anywhere with like the pandemic, the economy, all the different things that's happened. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that, and then if you're planning on moving to Japan, it's interesting to think about how it will change again in the next 10 years. I'm kind of in disguise today because I'm going to the hair salon later and I didn't wash my hair and it looked really gross, and I still kind of had a cold. I haven't been able to go outside for the last week, I guess. I got a terrible cold. I'm much better now, but I still have a cough and like generally a little bit sniffly, so apologies. I want to preface this video by saying that I love living and working in Japan, and I probably will stay here for many more years, but I'm going to be very open and honest in this video about working, because I think working in any country is not easy, and when you're working in a different country from your home country and when you're working in your non-native language, it is also incredibly hard. I of course have spent this last 10 years mostly working in the educational sector as my main job. I've worked in public schools, private schools, universities, companies, and I even worked in a hospital. And of course now I'm working in a conversational school, but I also have done many more jobs, and including translation. I worked a little bit in the games industry. Now I'm working as a designer, and I've also done like talent, model, SNS, and marketing. And I think in general, everyone I know has at least one job. Like most people are like baito senshi, so everyone has like a whole bunch of part-time jobs. And I think it's not indicative of Japan. I think in general, the economy in most countries has led to people having a lot of side hustles. So yeah, I'm gonna start this video back 10 years ago when I first moved to Japan. I believe I was 22 or 23, and I had just got my university degree. I studied something in computer related, and I used my degree to just straight away move to Japan. If you follow this channel, you probably already know my story, that I searched for like a company to do English teaching. I signed up with a very bad English dispatch company that dispatches ALTs, which are assistant language teachers. It was kind of risky because that company still runs to this day and is known for being really bad, but overall my first experience working in Japan was pretty good. The biggest pitfall I see is a lot of people won't have worked before, and they'll go through university and then they'll move to Japan, and that means that the whole process is incredibly overwhelming. I mean, you get thrown in the deep end. It doesn't matter what job you're working at. So from my experience, like people who have worked other jobs in their home country just adapt a little bit easier. I myself have been working since I was like 15, and I've worked in department stores, cafes and stuff like that. So for me, working wasn't so tough. And when you're moving to Japan, one of your biggest worries, and my biggest worry as well, was if I would be forced to do a lot of overtime and if that working hours were going to be very long. Because Japan has this image of overworking people, somewhat rightfully so, but if you're a foreigner working for a foreign company, they're most likely not going to work you to death. So that's something that I hope it eases your mind a little bit. And the first leg of my journey in Japan, I didn't get overworked at all. So I was placed in a public school in Saitama as an assistant language teacher, and yeah, it was honestly really fun. Like, these dispatch companies overall are pretty bad, but your whole experience will be dependent on what school that you are placed in if you're an English teacher. And like, honestly, it's a complete lottery. I've probably worked in about 16 or like 20 schools in Japan, and they've really varied in education and behavior, and just how willing the other teachers are to collaborate with a foreigner. And this is one of the biggest pitfalls that you'll suffer if you're wanting to teach English in Japan. As far as school, great, honestly, very good. The behavior of all the students was really nice. It was really countryside, so people weren't used to seeing foreigners, but I think that made them very patient and understanding. Like, because of course that wasn't stuff that I knew just arriving in Japan and living in Japan, so people were very patient with me. And in that 6 months working in that school, I learned so much about English teaching. But again, when you become an ALT, it also, your workload really depends. The school I was first placed in, I almost did nothing. Honestly, they wanted to do all their lesson plans themselves. And that is a good thing if you first start working in Japan, but then after the first few months, it gets incredibly boring when they basically just use you as their tape recorder. But luckily for me, they also placed me in a hospital nearby for the students that were sick, and I made all the lesson plans for that, and it honestly gave me something to mentally focus on, and I spent all my time on that. I always recommend people to become ALTs first if you're wanting to be an English teacher in Japan, or just generally working in Japan, because being an ALT really gives you an insight onto how Japan works. You get to experience like graduation ceremonies, sports days, clubs, stuff like that, stuff that is so inbuilt into Japanese heart and society. It really helps to bridge the gap between you and Japanese people, because a lot of people struggle to make friends, but if you've been through the Japanese school system and you've seen how it works, it's kind of a little bit easier. You kind of learn how people think, and you can relate to people in a lot of ways. Like you learn about like school lunch, so you can ask them about that. You can ask them what club they were in when they were in junior high school, what their teachers were like, and people really value and love their experience at school. It's very important to Japanese people, and a lot of effort, time and heart goes into teaching these lessons. So it's a really good way to bridge the gap between you and a society that you're maybe not familiar with. But yeah, actually in that first school, I did have something bad happen to me, and that was something that I feel like a lot of foreigners have to deal with, and this is something that I have dealt with a lot as an English teacher in Japan. There was a teacher who was about my age, and it became apparent that she didn't like me and she didn't want me to be in her class. And so eventually she stopped asking me to come to her class, which is kind of like against the rules. Like that's my job and I'm being paid to be there, so it became a whole issue. And I didn't quite know why she didn't like me. She didn't want to tell anyone, but I think what seems to happen a lot is that she got a little bit jealous that the students were always excited to see me, and perhaps she felt that they liked me more than her, despite obviously her putting so much effort into her lessons. The thing is like, I'm a foreigner, and a lot of these kids had never spoken to a foreigner before, and they've never got to interact with that one, so of course it's going to be exciting for them. And you know, like our jobs are just, you know, like they're different, and that seems to be something that happens a lot, is that when you're placed in a Japanese school, sometimes the teacher will want to fight you or be in competition with you rather than work with you. But the teachers I've worked with that really wanted to collaborate and, you know, use our skills. Obviously there's things that I'm not good at, like I'm not really good at, well at that time I wasn't really good at explaining grammar in Japanese, and so that was something I would rely on them for. And of course they would rely on me for like pronunciation and talking about culture and stuff like that. So when you meet someone that is willing to collaborate with you, it's honestly such a fun experience. Luckily for me, everyone else in the school really liked me, and I remember the principal told her off and said that if she kept kicking me out of her class, she would get a 30% pay cut. So she got over that pretty quickly, and then the rest of working at that school was smooth sailing. Then on to the second thing that happened that was quite bad, and that happens quite a lot, is that if you're working as an English teacher in Japan, your job is not stable. It's almost never stable. Honestly, I don't know anyone whose job is 100% stable. So if you're working for a dispatch company, it all depends on if your company keeps the contract for that city, because as I'm aware, or how I understand it, is that there are a lot of dispatch companies and they're constantly bidding, the cities are constantly bidding for which company they're going to use. And of course some companies will say, okay, well how about if we charge less money? What about if we give you 2 AOTs instead of 1? Like there's this constant bidding war going on, so sometimes you're just flat out at the end of your contract, your company will lose that placement and another company will swoop in. So this is something that can happen a lot. You might just straight up lose your contract, and so you have to go somewhere else. It's fine if you know that that's what can happen and you can make a plan B, but for me I didn't know. So the end of the first 6 months, I was told suddenly that I wouldn't be able to work there for the next 6 months, and my company gave me the option of moving far away to a different place or just quitting. In that 6 months, I feel like I gained a lot of experience, and I realized that the company I was working with wasn't that good. So I decided that I was just gonna quit that job and move to Shinjuku with my friend and find another job. Honestly, wouldn't recommend. The hardest part of living in Japan for me has honestly been when I didn't have a job and I had to find a job from scratch. Thankfully, this has only happened to me a couple of times, but it was really, really hard. But back then, this was before the pandemic, and I feel like there was a lot more opportunities and it was a lot easier to get a job. Like, you would just apply online, they would call you into the office and they would just say, okay, you're working here now. But now the job interview process is much harder, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So yeah, I didn't know what to do. I was looking at other AOT dispatch companies, and then I met someone who owned an eikaiwa, a Japanese person, and they were looking for a foreigner to work in their eikaiwa, and they just said, you know, like, why don't you work for us? In hindsight, this was a really bad idea because I didn't get more information. That's something that I know now, I didn't know then. Never take a job unless you really look at the contract, make sure everything's fine, make sure that they're gonna hire you for at least 6 months, and make sure that they are definitely in writing tell you that they will give you a visa. I know a lot of people living in Japan who would promise visas from companies, and this happens normally with startup companies, and this was a startup company, so this is something like I'm always wary of startup companies. They'll be told they get a visa, and then at the last moment the company will realize that actually giving foreigners visas is quite hard. Like, they have to do something, they need to hire a lawyer, and honestly a lot of these companies are too lazy to do that, so they would just fire you. So I found out my company wasn't going to give me a visa, so I had to already start looking for another job. But this job was a luxury conversational school for mostly celebrities and super rich people. So in that time, it wasn't completely bad. Like, I made a lot of connections. I taught really rich people. I taught one of the richest people in Japan. I taught a very famous comedian, and just generally like a bunch of rich people. So I did make some connections, but I realized that this was a Japanese company, so they would write me in at the start of the day, and then I would have no classes for like 4 or 5 hours, and then I would be in at the end of the day. So like my actual work start and work end sometimes would be 12 hours, and it was just too much. So I, of course, no visa, the crazy working hours, I was like, okay, I have to find another job. And one day I went to work, and the Japanese staff were there, and they were like worrying, and the other foreign staff was there and they seemed concerned, and it turned out that the owner, he hadn't been paying any of the bills. He didn't pay the electricity bill, he didn't pay the phone bill, he hadn't been paying the rent, and because our company wasn't making enough money, so the electricity went out and there wasn't any aircon, and I think it was in summer and it was really hot. So we were like, what do we do? And he just disappeared. Like, he upped and disappeared. Like, I think he disappeared and he went to another country. He just disappeared. So we didn't have any money, we didn't have any electricity, so we all decided to just go home. Luckily for that company, I think it did get bought out by someone else, so I think the company continued running. I'm not sure, but I like quit immediately because I was like, this is too much. So that was like another taste of disappointment, but at this point it wasn't all bad. Like, this is what I want to explain. I'm not complaining about working in Japan. I'm just saying that these experiences made me have a much realistic approach to working, and just helped me to understand that I need to always have a plan B, and I just needed to get better at making fail safes and checking the kind of job I was working at was legit. After that, I think I worked as an AOT for like a year. I worked in a bunch of schools. Some of them were really nice, others were not so nice, but overall that experience was pretty positive. I didn't have anything really bad happen during that time. It was just like general AOT work. What I didn't notice in that time though is, compared to my first school, those schools, a lot of them just didn't have any English curriculum, and also the teachers didn't speak any English, even though they're English teachers, and at least they were quite honest about that. So during that time I actually did make all the curriculums and lesson plans, and I was teaching mostly as a solo teacher, which actually was good for me. Like, I got a lot of experience doing that. But then after that contract was up, I realized I wanted to try something else. So I started working for an eikaiwa and conversational school. Also, half of the job was in corporate sales. So what they would do is they would send me to really big companies like Hitachi and NTT and the Hilton Hotel, and I would teach the upper management and like sometimes the service staff, and basically it was like working a lot closer with the companies. This was really interesting actually because I had to teach mostly business English. A lot of the classes were quite difficult and there are companies hiring someone, so the stakes became a lot higher. Like they wanting to make sure that they were getting their money's worth for what they were paying, which was quite high. So I had to make the lessons very, very good. It was a lot of pressure, honestly, but I kind of enjoyed it. Like I got to do a lot of seminars, like one where we spoke to a room of like 300 people. We got to do a lot of really fun stuff. I wouldn't recommend it if you are quite shy or if you kind of crumble under pressure, but for me, I actually really enjoyed that job. But here's the thing. The pay per hour was great. I think it was like 4,500 yen per hour, but because these projects is just like 1 or 2 classes per day, I was making about the same amount as an AOT, or even less as an AOT, but just teaching 2 hours a day. But the time it took me to get to these places, because they were always like mumblefuck nowhere, honestly it wasn't worth it for me, and it was just a lot more pressure, and I just felt like I wasn't, like, if I'm not getting paid more, like why would I do that over just doing something really easy? So that's when I found the job that I would be doing for like 6 years. There was a company I wanted to work for quite a while, but you needed a few years of experience to be able to work there. So when I finally had the experience, I mailed them, I had an interview, and yeah, they decided that they would actually hire me. Again, I really enjoyed this job for the full 6 years that I worked there because the school was pretty good, but the company itself was honestly really bad. Like, looking at it now, it was actually pretty bad. Like, it was like these 2 foreign guys and 1 Japanese guy. Like, the actual office staff were really, really small. And the British guys that I worked for, they were just like, I don't know how to explain it, but just like extremely incompetent. Just like incredibly incompetent. Like, they would fuck up everything. And the issue is that like they also wouldn't take any responsibility. So I remember the first time I had an interview or had to have a meeting with the school I would be working at, the British guy told me the wrong name of the station, and so I went to a different station and to go to the school, and I'm waiting there like confused looking for the Japanese staff, and we're at 2 different places like 40 minutes apart. So I called the British guy. I'm like, oh, and then I was like, I think that you got the station name wrong. I think it might be this. The guy got really, really annoyed because obviously he was embarrassed that he made a mistake, and I still remember it to this day. He was like, I am not infallible. Sometimes people make mistakes, blah, 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 blah. And I never attacked him. I was like, oh, I think I'm at the wrong place. So at first I was like, working for this company seems like it's going to be hard. Like working literally anywhere, one of the hardest parts of working this 10 years has just been dealing with people's egos. Like, I've had to deal with my boss's egos because they wouldn't accept any responsibility if they were wrong, and I've had to deal with like my coworkers' egos, because when you're working with people whose not native language is English, particularly Japanese people, are very, very shy and they're very prideful. So you have to work with them in a way that doesn't make them feel like their English is bad, but a lot of the time their English isn't good either. So it's just constantly like walking on eggshells. And again, that's just another really, really difficult part of working this last 10 years. Luckily, you don't actually have to talk to your dispatch company that much. Mostly just you're going to be dealing with the schools. So yeah, I worked at this school for 6 years, and honestly, most of it was pretty good. I made the entire curriculum for the school. So yeah, it was really, really fun for me, honestly, and very, very rewarding. But here comes maybe the worst thing that's happened to me working in Japan has been this one coworker. I made a video about this already, and I'm sure you've heard me talk about it previously, but I had this coworker and we worked together the full 6 years. This Japanese woman, I think she's like 40, and she at first really, really liked me, and her, on the spectrum of all the Japanese English teachers I've worked with, her English is definitely like maybe the worst. Like bottom 3 for sure. Like, it was terrible. Like, unintelligible. But I was really nice with her, really patient with her, and like as I worked with her, her English did improve a little bit. But honestly, she couldn't say one sentence in English. Like, it was really, really bad. But she believed that her English was really, really good, and that because she was a Japanese teacher, that she should be the one in charge. The issue was, like, the way that the jobs were written was actually I was technically her boss. Like, I wasn't an assistant language teacher. Like, I'm the main teacher and she is my assistant. And she really, like, that became the biggest points of contention between us, was that she didn't like that even on paper she was considered my assistant. And a lot of the classes we didn't even work together. Like, we were in separate rooms. So, like, I don't get what her problem was. And of course, over time, it became kind of like a power struggle. And it ended in her, honestly, like, power harassing me. Power hara is something that happens a lot in Japan. Is when, you know, people in positions of power are using their power to bully you. And that's kind of like what happened. Particularly the last 2 years I worked with her was really, really bad. Like, she was super rude to me all the time. She would shout at me. And she would try to make fun of me, kind of thing. But like, I didn't really mind that much because I liked my job, and honestly this job gave me a lot of benefits. The pay was good, and so like I was willing to put up with it. And none of our co-workers liked her, and the children just despised her, like loathed her, which didn't actually work in my favor. Like, she was objectively a bad teacher, so obviously the kids didn't like her, so that became like an annoying thing, is that she would get mad when they would prefer me over her. I didn't realize that particularly the last year working with her, she had been calling the school board and complaining about me. To this day, we're not sure exactly what she was complaining about. We had a lot of meetings with her at the end, and honestly, she couldn't really come up with anything. Like, her main point was that because I didn't graduate university in Japan, I couldn't be a real teacher in Japan. So like, we had this thing for a while. And she kept saying that I should be better educated, which is hilarious because I have more experience as a teacher than her, and I am also better qualified than her. But anyway, most of this was rooted in xenophobia because, again, she didn't want to be working below a foreigner. That's like the whole point of this. So anyways, finally the school board, who have never met any of us, decided that because there was like trouble going on, they would just, at the end of the contract, they would just remove both of us without like fully assessing the situation. So the end of my 6th contract there, we just both lost our jobs. And yeah, it was just really annoying because I really, really liked that job, and the company I worked for didn't have a whole lot of schools. So like, after that, I just had to find another job. And it happened super, super suddenly. They were really dragging their feet and they didn't know what to do. And at the last moment, I was like, okay, we'll just remove both of these teachers because they're being annoying. And yeah, so I suddenly lost my job out of nowhere. The only good thing is that like the principal of the school was really, really apologetic. He was like, he called me in his office and he was like crying. It was really awkward. And they did give me a really nice severance package, but it just honestly hurt a lot, like to lose your job probably because of xenophobia. And the thing is like, working in Japan with these kind of situations, if there's any trouble going on, normally they will just remove everyone from the situation. Like, I don't feel bad about their decision because this is just what happens. Like, if they see people causing trouble, they won't look at which is right or wrong. They will just try and cut out the situation. I think that's not just Japan. I think just HR in general is like this. Like, HR generally don't help you, they want to help the company. So that was just the final the end of that, and then it ended up just me having to suddenly look for a new job. But I want to say, like, everything that happened was really, really sucky, but I got to work at a job that I liked for 6 years, and I got a lot of experience. I had a lot of good memories, and I had a lot of benefits working there, and overall, like, I made quite a bit of money. So I promise you I'm not complaining. Like, the final resolution did suck, but I don't feel that hard done by. Like, I feel like it could have been worse. But honestly, the worst part about this was going back into doing job interviews. I don't know what's happened in this last 10 years, but I feel like it used to be way easier to get jobs. And I think it's the same, like, I go on Reddit a lot and it seems like the whole world is like this now. Like, jobs that were previously requiring me to have 1 job interview, now they did like 2, 3, 4 job interviews. And I did a bunch of job interviews that were like 3, 4 steps, and I'd get to the last step and realize that I didn't want the job because they wouldn't reveal like the salary or the hours or the placement until the last interview. And then by I got to that point, I realized that I didn't want the job. So that was probably another one of the really bad things about working in Japan for 10 years. But again, I don't think this is something about Japan specifically. I just think this is a symptom of capitalism where we're being forced to do all these job interviews, and I just personally I think it's unnecessary. I have another video about the job interviews that I did because honestly there were some pretty whack ones, but for now I'll just say it was just kind of tough. But eventually I went back to working at the eikaiwa I worked at before, and because I have so many other little part-time jobs, I make a lot of money not from my main job, so it is fine. I just started working part-time at this school, and yeah, for now it's working out for me. So as I mentioned before, I do a lot of other things, and one of the first jobs I started to do was translation, and I was translating Japanese visual novel games into English with like 2 other people, and that is one of the best jobs I got to do because the company we were working for was really small, but they made a lot of money. So honestly, the money was great. I think one project that took 2 months, I ended up making like 500,000 yen. It was great. And the problem is that like there was a lot of scripts. So I was working my main job and then doing this when I got home. So I was working like constantly for like 2 months straight. But overall, that job was really fun, and yeah, it made a lot of money. So that's probably one of my favorite jobs that I got to do. I did do like talent and modeling stuff, which I still do now, honestly. But a lot of those kind of like talent agencies, of course you have to go to auditions, and for me it just doesn't really work because I also work most days, and so it's hard for me to schedule that. And honestly, like a lot of these auditions were like really far. You get there and then there's a lot of people there that look like you, and they just ask you to like spin around or like say a line or do something, and then they ask you to leave. The whole process I just felt really dehumanizing. I know a lot of people in Japan that are models and talents and they really enjoy it, but for me I don't think I could do it full time. I think particularly because I have ADHD and I'm bad at scheduling, it just didn't work for me. I got to be in some music videos, I got to model like kimono and like wedding dresses and stuff like that, so overall like it was really fun. Probably my favorite thing that I managed to do is making money from SNS and marketing and YouTube and stuff like that, because that's easier for me because I can work when I have time and I have a lot more control over my hours and my content, and it's 100% produced by me, so then I don't have to worry about like my coworkers not liking me or people not reaching deadlines. It's just completely on me, and I feel like for me it just works a little bit better. And so like my goal for the next year is I want to work a lot more and do a lot more streaming and a lot more YouTube videos, because I think that's where I really have fun, is making and editing YouTube videos. And then if you've been following this channel for a while, you probably know that my other job is I work as a fashion designer. I do this job part-time. I work for a Japanese company and I design clothes, and I work for their SNS marketing team, and I take like messages and in English, and I also do translation. That's really fun actually, because I get to use a lot of skills that I have with design and like drawing and marketing and stuff like that, and my coworkers are really nice, and just in general it's not too much pressure but enough pressure to still be exciting, and I really like producing and making clothes. So yeah, right now I'm just having a good time. So yeah, that's been my journey this 10 years. Honestly, I feel like in some ways it got tougher. As I've mentioned before in previous videos, the average of salaries in Japan have not risen in 30 years. And I really have noticed this. Like, the jobs that I am doing now pay about the same as the jobs I had when I first arrived in Japan. And for example, the private school job that I did, those similar jobs now are actually paying less money than my job was, and I've noticed that some salaries in the English teaching sector have actually decreased, and this is a very bad thing. And like during the pandemic, we thought that it would make more jobs for people when we were all stuck here, but then we found out that of course because we were stuck here, people weren't traveling, so a lot of eikaiwas were closing down, which meant less jobs for people, and just people become less interested in studying English. After the pandemic, it has picked up a lot more, but I find there are a lot more foreigners moving to Japan, which also means less jobs. the economy is also doing worse and worse, so honestly I predict the next 10 years is gonna maybe do a little bit worse. I'm hoping for some amazing economic boom where we start making a lot of money again, but realistically I don't think that's gonna happen. I wouldn't recommend moving to Japan for like economic reasons unless you're being paid in dollars or another currency, because I have a lot of friends who are like remote workers or digital nomads, and if they're getting paid in a foreign currency, because the yen is so weak, they actually make so much money. It does so well. So if that's what you do, I would recommend moving to Japan, but otherwise, yeah, I wouldn't recommend moving here just for money. But yeah, so this 10 years, I'm not gonna lie, it's been really tough. Like, I did lose my job a few times. I've had trouble with coworkers, bosses, stuff like that. But I think a lot of those things are symptoms of capitalism and not Japan. And I've gained so much experience. I've met so many wonderful people, and I've got so many opportunities. Like, I got to do so many fun things. So I'm very grateful and happy that I did end up moving to Japan. And now I'm working with YouTube and I'm designing and doing stuff like that. I'm very grateful that I went through the struggles of doing jobs that I possibly didn't like. That's my final thing I want to say, that like sometimes you don't like your job, or the job you're taking isn't necessarily ideal, but that's not going to be what you're doing forever. As long as you have enough money to survive and you have enough money to do the things you want to do or build towards what you want, then I think that's the most important thing, and that's my biggest advice. But yeah, let me know if you have any more questions. Thank you for listening to this incredibly long and rambling video about living in Japan. Thanks for watching, and please subscribe!